In 1963, I was in charge of a thrashing machine owned by my father, thrashing wheat for a local farmer. The machine was powered by a tractor. We last used steam in 1947. We finished thrashing in 1964 and then combine harvesters took over. So what a wonderful opportunity, courtesy of Jonathan Wheeler, to watch a proper stack of wheat being thrashed, not just a trailer load. My good friend, Andy Wilkinson, is an expert filmmaker, but knows nothing about thrashing. I know little about thrashing, but nothing about filmmaking. So we combined our talents and produced this short film. A typical corn stack was made up of the product of about 10 acres and took a day to thrash. The stack would produce about 10 tonnes of grain, so that's about a tonne an acre. This yield was the norm until plant breeding improved, and that was after the Second World War. When each time a sheaf goes in the drum, where it goes through the beaters, you can hear the extra pull on the engine. You can hear it chuffing louder when it's having to work a bit harder. And then ideally you have almost a constant flow, but that isn't quite, they're just starting the stack, so they haven't quite got that going yet. It's a bit of an art to get the sheaves in a constant feed to the chap who's having to cut the strings and then feed them into the top of the drum. They've just put some coal on the fire, so you're getting some smoke. But of course in a stack yard where you would have perhaps 3 or 4 stacks of straw like this, of corn, there's a danger of sparks. So you have to have the spark arrestor on the top that stops any bits of coal or inflammable material coming out, so you just get smoke, because there was always a fire risk. If you're looking at it from this end, which is the back, the drum is towed in a direction away from us with a drawbar in front of the small wheels. You've got the main shaft with the power from the engine, and then a secondary drive going to the baler. But you see the smaller belts. There's a belt that comes down vertically from the main shaft, which is driving a fan, so that the grain is dropped past that fan at some stage, so that the light chaff is blown out and then goes to the fan just this side of where the bags are. That's the husks off the grain and the chaff, which has little value but has to be obviously taken away. So that's blown up and then goes into one of those 2 sacks. And you see that the parts of the sieves that are going backwards and forwards, they're suspended by ash, pieces of ash that are fixed at the top, and then they are going backwards and forwards to shape the grain through the holes in the sieves. But the ash is the wood that will take the constant whipping action from a fixed point to moving perhaps 5 or 6 inches each way at the bottom. I haven't seen any rats here, but the stack was only built 2 months ago. Before grain was stored in silos, stacks weren't thrashed until the grain was needed by the millers. In the autumn, the rats used to move from the fields into the stacks, and it wasn't unusual to kill 100 or more rats in just one stack. See there that drum, so that it's in fact a winch, so that if something got stuck in a boggy stackyard, you could take a pin out of this driving wheel, which I'll show you in a minute. So the shaft turned, but the wheel didn't, and then you could feed your wire rope through these rollers up here, and then attach it to the front of your thrashing machine and pull it through the mud while the machine was the traction engine was stationary. So to use the winch, you remove that pin, and then the shaft would turn with the winch rope, but the wheel would stay stationary. Using steam to drive a thrashing machine needed working steam pressure when you were ready to start in the morning. The engine driver would bank the fire up at night, but then of course he had to be at work an hour before start time, were to rake out and make up the fire. And then his mate would be uncovering the drum and oiling the bearings. On Saturday lunchtimes, my father would bank the fire up and then visit on Sunday to put more coal on, so he didn't have to have a really early start on Monday morning. He'd then have to light a new fire. So as a child, he'd seat me on the crossbar of his bike, ride to the engine, then sit me in the tender while he sorted out the fire. Andy, just checking the RPM of the main shaft with a device there that he put on the axle. In a traditional farmyard, when pre-combine harvesters, the stacks would be built so that you had the one where they're unloading now, when they're taking the stack down, and there would be another one this side, the same distance away, so that you could thrash 2 stacks and only move the machine once. And then where the straw trusser is, you would have a massive stack of loose straw that came out of the far end of the machine and went up an elevator, and that stack would have to accommodate the straw from the 2 stacks either side, and then you would have a gap between the stacks longitudinally, so you would then bring your machine back a machine's length and a bit more, and then you would have another pair, so you'd perhaps have 8 stacks, 4 on each side, and then you would end up with a row of straw stacks where the machine had originally stood. See there the length of the straw where it's useful for thatching, and then on the top is the ear where all the grains have been thrashed out. Then if we look at the back, I'll show you where there is some where the grains are still in and we can compare them. If you look there, which is the unthrashed straw, ordinary wheat would be about as long as that, everyday wheat. This is another 18 inches longer. The straw you see is over 3 feet long, where today the common varieties are about that length. So this has a value for thatching, obviously. And the heads here, before it's thrashed, you see the chaff on the sides of the grain. So if you strip the grains off, which is essentially what happens in the thrashing machine, and then rub it to get the husks off the grain, and then you've got a fan in the thrashing machine, like that, and then you end up with the grains of wheat. So when that's milled, you've got the husk which goes on when you get your whole meal, and then it's obviously refined, and then you just got the white flour in the middle, and they're the grains there that are producing it. The trusser is a Lanz made in Germany, probably pre-World War II, and it folds the straw up or bundles the straw, but it doesn't break it, so you can undo the trusses and use the straw for thatching. You get somebody who would drop a sheaf of corn into the drum without cutting the band, which would make a great big bang, sometimes make the belt come off, but always got a shout from the man in charge of the traction engine or the outfit to make sure they don't do it again. But it is possible when you're dealing with thousands a day to miss one and drop it in a hole without, if you notice when they feed them in, they allow the sheaf to sort of run off their arm so that the stalks go in gradually rather than in one great big lump. Depending on the cash flow on the farm, sometimes they would, as they harvested it, would bring the machine in and rather than make it into a stack, would feed it straight in the machine. So the farmer got some wheat he could sell perhaps at the end of September to see him through until Christmas time. But where cash flow wasn't an issue, they would perhaps start thrashing in New Year and then go on for 2 or 3 weeks. So the men were working 8 hours a day, and it was perhaps only half an hour for lunch. And occasionally a sort of smoke break in the morning, but not everywhere. And so it was a case of starting as soon as it was light and finishing as it got dark. And of course you couldn't do it when it was raining heavily, so if it was wet then you had to stop. pre-combine harvester days, so you're going back to the 1950s and earlier, because people didn't have showers, and not many people living in farm accommodation had baths. So all you had was a bowl and a flannel, and if you can see the amount of dust here now, and some of them, all you could see was by 5 o'clock were the whites of their eyes, and all they'd got to do to clean themselves was a bowl and a flannel, and of course no washing machines or laundry. Although my father always wore a boiler suit, and my mother insisted that one went to the laundry every week, because she refused to wash that without a washing machine. And I can't honestly say I blame her, what with coal dust and grease. The tarpaulin that covered your machine on the front folded up, because they used to be made of what was known as duck cloth, and when they were wet they were hellishly heavy. So rather than go to the effort of folding it up and taking it down on the ground, you folded it up, and there was a way you folded it up, put it up the top there where it was safe. So if it rained, you only had to, and at night, you only had to unfurl it rather than having to carry it up on your back on a ladder. You don't have to have the belt that tight, because first of all the pulleys are convex, so the belt tends to run to the centre all the time, and secondly, where it's pulling across the top of the pulley, you have one side of it tight and then the other side is slack, and that's a normal way you do it without having them really tight. You see it probably more so on the engine one, where the bottom bit is from the bottom flywheel of the engine to the top of the drum pulley is quite tight, and then the other part from the top of the engine flywheel is the slack part. And they're just leather, you don't have to have any sticky stuff or anything to make them work. The sacks are taken off when they're full, put on the weighing machine, should be 18 stone in old money, so they have a container there, so he's taking wheat out a little at a time until the weighing machine balances. And then they're sold to were always sold to the merchant on the understanding and trust that they were carefully weighed as they came off the machine. That's a fowl that was made at St Ives, and they're easy to identify because the front axle is back under the boiler, which was supposed to make them more manoeuvrable in stackyards and give them a smaller turning circle. It was built in 1922. And I think the fowl works were down by the railway station in St Ives, not far from what I think is the Oliver Cromwell pub. Engineering works where they could build steam engines ideally was situated by a railway and with a decent water source. And then there's a name on the back of the tender, Edwards Brothers, Great Raveley Huntingdon, or Hunts, and I understand that when you own the engine, you could put your own name and address on, but if it wasn't paid for, it just carried a plate with the name of the manufacturer. So if it was on HP, it had the manufacturer's name, and only when it was totally paid for were you allowed to put your own name and address on it. This has got a clearer view of the winch, where the wheel isn't quite as close to the body of the engine, so that you can see clearly where the wire rope is, and then when you were pulling something, the rope was fed between these two rollers at the bottom here. It's got a Huntingdonshire registration because the letters EW were one of a few similar ones that were allocated to vehicles first registered in Huntingdon. The method of filling the engines up before there were Bowsers was a suction hose with a device like that on the bottom, where you would go to the village pond or the stream, and that would keep out the tiddlers and the straw, but not unfortunately the tadpoles. You can see the levers to slide the gear across to engage the cogwheel next to the rear wheel, and to change gear you had to block the engine, stop it moving, move the gears across and then take off again in the next gear, so that if you were going up a hill, for example, you needed to be in the right gear at the bottom because you couldn't stop halfway up, but you have to stop and block all your wheels to go down to a lower gear. Where they're loading up the straw bundles, they're building in there at the top where they're coming off the rods up from the baler, up from the press. When we were building high stacks without an elevator, we'd form what was called a dicky hole, where somebody would stand at that level and then they could pick them up with a fork and pitch them up to the people at the top, because there was no means of getting them once they got to the top of the elevator up to the top of the stack if the stack was very high. So you formed a hole for somebody to stand in, he'd hook the fork into the bale and throw them over his head. And then when you finished the stack, you came down and filled in the dicky hole so that there was no chance of the water getting in. You can see where the money is in farming, where the only new registration, 7.1, is on the Thatcher's truck. Everything else looks to be 10 years old or more. Perhaps that says something about the state of British agriculture.